They are called Tajiks today, Persian-speaking, Central Asian, often mistaken for distant cousins of Iranians or Afghans. But long before names were carved into national maps, long before Persian poetry echoed through the bazaars of Samarkand or the valleys of Badakhshan, these people were already here. Standing at the heart of Eurasia, they watched empires rise and fall like dust storms. Alexander came and left. Arabs brought their script, and Mongols their fire. Yet the DNA beneath the soil tells a quieter, older story, one that has never truly faded. It begins not in the pages of history, but in the silence of skeletons. Deep beneath the layers of sediment in Central Asia, scientists uncovered a puzzle that no textbook had prepared them for. Skulls buried thousands of years ago, from the windswept grasslands of the steppe to the dry floors of vanished cities in the Oxus, bore genetic echoes that still live in Tajik veins today. But here's the twist. The Tajiks, though speakers of Persian, aren't descended from Persians. Their language came from the west, yes, but their blood runs from the east, the north, and even the south. It's here the mystery begins. The Tajik genome doesn't sit neatly in a box. It stretches across empires and millennia. It holds the rugged imprint of ancient Indo-Iranian steppe warriors, the same horse riders who thundered down from the Eurasian plains 4,000 years ago, carrying the fire of a language family that would one day dominate half the world. But those warriors didn't ride into emptiness. They met the builders of Bactria and Margiana, farming civilizations already flourishing in lush oases, worshipping fire, building palaces, and trading lapis with the Indus Valley. And then something astonishing happened. The warriors and the farmers didn't just clash, they merged. Not in conquest, but in lineage. The result was a hybrid people, part steppe, part civilization, fierce and rooted, mobile and urban. Their children carried the blood of both worlds, and they stayed. This is the foundation of the Tajik genetic story. Not a single origin, but a synthesis. And we see it in the DNA today. The powerful presence of the R1a haplogroup, a male lineage that stormed across the steppe during the Bronze Age, combined with the maternal legacy of BMAC farmers and Iranian plateau settlers. It's a duality as old as civilization itself. But what makes the Tajik story unlike any other is that this genetic fusion, this delicate balance, didn't get erased by the tidal waves of history. It held steady. Through invasions, cultural shifts, empire after empire, Tajiks remained startlingly similar to Iron Age Central Asians in their genetic makeup. This isn't just rare. It's nearly unheard of. While most populations around the world underwent major shifts, absorbing conquerors, mixing with migrants, and losing track of their origins, the Tajiks kept their genetic core intact. Scientists call it continuity. We might just call it survival. And yet, survival wasn't stillness. Over time, other threads began to weave into this tapestry, surprising, sometimes puzzling threads. From the east came whispers of Mongol and Turkic nomads. From the south, a strange and ancient signal, unmistakably South Asian. And from the roof of the world, another voice entirely, one that would shock even seasoned geneticists. But we'll get to those in time. For now, what matters is this. Beneath the Persian words, beyond the political maps, the Tajik genome speaks. And what it says is older than kings. It speaks of fire worshippers and horse lords, of valleys guarded by ancestors who never left, of a people written not in borders or books, but in stone and silence. Long before the first Persian word was ever spoken in Central Asia, long before the Silk Road wove its way across mountains and deserts, the land that would become home to the Tajiks was already humming with life. But not the kind etched into dynastic chronicles or carved on palace walls. It was a quiet revolution, one written in the genes of farmers and riders. Thousands of years ago, two worlds moved slowly toward each other. From the northern grasslands, the Indo-Iranian steppe nomads descended, masters of horses, fire, and sky. Their lives pulsed with the rhythm of migration. They rode not only with cattle and carts, but with language. Language that would seed civilizations from India to Scandinavia. Their bloodline bore the genetic marker R1AM17, a signature so enduring that even today, over half of Tajik men carry it like a silent badge of ancestry. But the steppe was only half the story. To the south, a vastly different rhythm unfolded. Here lay the oasis kingdoms of the Bactria, Margiana Archaeological Complex, BMAC. These were settled people, builders of temples and traders of lapis lazuli. They crafted elaborate pottery, buried their dead with care, and left behind no written script, only the archaeological traces of a world that had already known order, myth, and permanence. Their DNA, shaped by millennia of agriculture and ritual, flowed from the Iranian plateau and brushed against the Indus Valley far to the south. And then, around 4,000 years ago, these two currents met, not in fire, but in fusion. The Indo-Iranian nomads didn't destroy the BMAC towns. They married into them. The sons of the steppe took daughters of the oasis. Languages bent, myths merged, and something new was born. A hyperpopulation that no empire created and no conqueror defined. This was the ancestral core of the Tajiks. Not a tribe, not a nation, but a genetic alloy, forged in the crucible of Bronze Age Central Asia. A people with the mobility of the steppe and the memory of the soil. Their bones held the dynamic codes of both worlds, pastoralist endurance and urban sophistication. They were neither fully Eastern nor Western, but something in between, a living bridge between the Indo-European and Iranian worlds. And the evidence? It's carved not in stone, but in strands of DNA recovered from Iron Age cemeteries in what is now Turkmenistan and southern Tajikistan. Geneticists found something astonishing. Modern Tajiks are almost indistinguishable from these ancient individuals. Their genomes echo a continuity so rare in Eurasia that it rewrites assumptions about what it means to be native to a place. This wasn't a civilization that was replaced, it evolved. While Persians of the West mixed more with Near Eastern lineages, and Turkic peoples brought East Asian genes from the steppe, the Tajiks stayed anchored to the genetic blueprint set down during the Bronze Age. Even more fascinating is what this says about memory. Written history forgot the BMAC. No one remembered its cities by name. Yet the people who lived there never really left. Their legacy wasn't lost. It was passed forward quietly, generation after generation, embedded in the chromosomes of children who would one day be called Tajik. And so, when we talk about Tajik origins, we're not just talking about geography. We're talking about the survival of a deep ancestral fusion, unshaken by the sweep of imperial banners or the spread of foreign tongues. This forgotten origin, this meeting between rider and farmer, between wilderness and settlement, is not merely a genetic fact. It's a story of balance, of cultural alchemy, of human history distilled into the marrow of a people. No wonder the Tajik genome holds steady, even as borders change, because the foundation it was built on was never just political or linguistic. It was biological, and it was built to last. Beneath the sands of western China, in the arid silence of the Darim basin, bodies began to emerge, astonishingly well preserved, dressed in woolen garments, some with Caucasoid features, others with tattoos, and eyes wide open as if still watching the stars. These were not the mummies of Egypt, wrapped in ritual and gold. These were the forgotten dead of a forgotten world. And for decades, no one knew who they were. Then came the shock. When geneticists sequenced their DNA, the results rewrote the history of Inner Asia. These Bronze Age people, sealed in desert silence for 4,000 years, were not Chinese, not Turkic, and not Mongol. They belonged to an isolated and ancient genetic lineage, closer to Ice Age Siberians than any known modern group. They carried ancestry so old it seemed cut off from time, a ghost population long assumed extinct. But then, another twist. A faint signature of that same DNA turned up in the highlands of Tajikistan, not among the city dwellers or the lowland farmers, but among the Pamari Tajiks, those who live where oxygen thins, where stone meets sky. It wasn't expected. It wasn't supposed to be there. Yet there it was, unmistakable, a sliver of the Darim genome embedded within the DNA of a people who had no documented connection to those ancient mummies. No trade route between them, no historical record, just genes whispering across mountains and millennia. And this changed everything, because it meant the Darim Basin people, long believed to have vanished without descendants, had not entirely disappeared. A small trace of their lineage endured, silently preserved in the bloodlines of those who lived far to the west, along the fractured roof of the Pamirs. This was no ordinary admixture. It wasn't part of the usual BMAC step fusion that defined much of Tajik ancestry. This was something else, something older, something rare. Researchers began to map the distribution, and they found that Pamari subgroups like the Waki and Shugni carried more of this ancient Darim component than Tajiks in Dushanbe or Samarkand. The implication was clear. This wasn't a pan-Tajik legacy. It was a mountain-born inheritance, passed down quietly in isolation, untouched by the sweeping migrations that reshaped the rest of Central Asia. Why there? Why only the Pamirs? The answer may lie in the brutal geography itself. The Pamirs, often called the roof of the world, are a natural fortress, glacial, remote, and largely impenetrable for much of human history. Where armies marched across open steppes and traders moved through desert basins, the Pamirs remained still. Populations settled and stayed. Genetic drift happened in silence. And somewhere in that stillness, a fragment of the Darim mummies lived on. It's a haunting realization. For generations, the Darim people were treated as an evolutionary dead end, a cultural curiosity sealed by sand. But now we know they echo in the heartbeat of a modern people, and they do so not through conquest or empire, but through hidden continuity, the kind that escapes historical memory, but not molecular inheritance. This isn't just a genetic footnote. It's a profound reminder that our maps of ancestry are incomplete, that history often misplaces its orphans, that sometimes what vanishes in text survives in blood. The Pamari Tajiks, through their unique isolation and survival, offer a living archive, not just of Indo-Iranian heritage, but of something deeper, something that predates cities and scripts, a bridge between Ice Age wanderers and Bronze Age builders, a resonance from a population thought long gone, now flickering in mitochondrial strands and autosomal traces. And so, the Darim Basin, once silent, speaks again, not in stone tablets or oral myth, but in genomes that remember what empires forgot. For centuries, historians believed they knew where the story of the Tajiks began, somewhere between the Oxus and the Zarafshan, anchored in the legacy of Eastern Iranian tribes, shaped by steppe and soil. Their language linked them westward. Their location tethered them to the heart of Central Asia. But there was something missing, a shadow in the data, a piece of ancestry that didn't fit the northern script. And then, buried in the unlikeliest corners of their genome, it was found. A trace from far beyond the Hindu Kush. It wasn't obvious. For years, this southern signal was obscured by the dominance of West Eurasian and steppe components. But with deeper sequencing and sharper tools, geneticists began to detect something unexpected, a South Asian imprint in Tajik DNA. Subtle but unmistakable. It didn't come from recent migrations. It wasn't a product of modern trade or colonial crossings. It was older, ancient in fact. Embedded deep in the autosomal layers of their genetic code was an affinity to populations from the Indian subcontinent. A link not through empire, but through time. And this wasn't a one-off anomaly. It kept showing up across different Tajik samples, from Afghanistan to Tajikistan, and even among high-altitude groups in the eastern Pamirs. The genetic signal aligned with haplogroups found primarily in South Asia, R2, L, M20, H1, M52. These weren't incidental. They were part of a broader pattern, a forgotten exchange, etched into the bones of both men and women. But how? And when? To understand that, one must look beyond genetics and into the fragile threads of ancient contact. Long before the Silk Road, long before Persian became the language of empire, there were routes, winding, rugged, and unrecorded, that linked Central Asia with the Indus Valley. Through mountain passes and river basins, goods traveled, ideas moved, and sometimes, so did people. The Bactrian-Margiana culture, already a genetic pillar of Tajik ancestry, shared artifacts and trade links with early South Asian civilizations. Seals, motifs, and pottery suggest interaction. But the DNA goes further. It suggests that human movement, real, reproductive migration, occurred across those southern frontiers. Some researchers placed this admixture around 1,000 to 1,500 years ago, coinciding with the late Kushan and early Islamic periods, when the boundaries between Central Asia and northern India were more porous than today. Others argue for a Bronze Age pulse, when the Harappan world was collapsing and populations were shifting northward. Either way, the result is the same: a permanent southern imprint in a northern people. What makes this even more compelling is who doesn't carry it. Among Tajik subpopulations, the Yagnobis, a geographically isolated Eastern Iranian-speaking group, lack this South Asian component entirely. Their DNA mirrors older, more unblended steppe BMAC ancestry. This contrast is critical. It proves the South Asian input wasn't universal across ancient Central Asia. It was selective, regional, and most likely historical, not prehistoric. Moreover, it's not just autosomal. Maternal haplogroups, particularly subclades of AM and are common in the Indian subcontinent, appear in Tajik women as well. This wasn't a one-sided story. It wasn't limited to male-driven conquest or trade marriages. It was full-spectrum integration, with roots that have endured. In some regions, the proportion is surprisingly high. Xinjiang Tajiks, especially those from the eastern Pamirs, show over 20% South Asian admixture in some models. That's not noise, it's signal. It tells us that movement through the mountains wasn't just east-west along the Silk Road. It was also north-south, threading India to inner Asia in ways historians have rarely documented. And so the image of the Tajiks grows more complex. Not just heirs of Indo-Iranian steppe nomads, not merely descendants of Iranian plateau farmers, but also distant cousins to the peoples of South Asia, connected not by conquest, but by long-forgotten currents of human movement. A shared past, scattered by time, but preserved in chromosomes. This southern presence doesn't change the identity of the Tajiks. It deepens it. It reveals that even in the mountains, even in the valleys carved by winter wind and empire, there was always a conversation with the south, a whisper from beyond the passes, a shadow that became part of the light. There's a quiet tension in Central Asia's genetic landscape, a tug-of-war between East and West that left traces not only in languages and empires, but in chromosomes. And nowhere is this more delicately inscribed than in the DNA of the Tajiks. For centuries, waves of nomads swept across the Eurasian steppe. Some vanished without a trace. Others redrew the human map. But the ones that left a genetic signature came from the East. Turkic tribes, Mongol warbands, Xiongnu confederations older than recorded Chinese history. They moved not just with arrows and horses, but with genes. The Tajiks, rooted in the Iranian-speaking world, stood directly in the path of this movement. Yet they were not consumed by it. Instead, what entered was measured, not erasure, but sediment. Roughly 15 to 18% of their genome, today, reflects East Eurasian ancestry. It arrived not in one flood, but in pulses. Some during the time of the Huns, others under Turkic Khaganates, and the last great infusion under the banners of Genghis Khan. But this story, too, defies expectation. Because while geneticists can trace East Asian components in Tajik DNA, including Y chromosome haplogroups like C, M217, and Q, M242, both tied to East Asian male lineages, the maternal lines tell a different story. Eastern mitochondrial haplogroups, like D and G, are present but less common. The pattern is clear. The Eastern genes that entered were largely through men. It's a pattern etched across the continent, a legacy of conquest dynamics, where male soldiers left children far from their homeland, while local women passed on the region's older genetic signature. Among Tajiks, this asymmetry is vivid. Y-DNA shows a small but distinct presence of lineages carried by Turkic and Mongol tribes. These are not dominant, but they're consistent. They suggest limited intermarriage, perhaps between local communities and ruling elites, or between sedentary women and roaming warriors. Yet the core paternal identity, R1AM17, remained dominant, a legacy of the earlier Indo-Iranian migrations. That dominance is part of what makes the Tajik genome so unique. The Eastern influence exists, but it never overwhelmed. Unlike their Turkic-speaking neighbors, Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, Kazakhs, whose East Asian ancestry can exceed 50%, the Tajiks retained a genetic core that stayed largely West Eurasian. Still, even a minority component tells a powerful story. In highland communities near the borders of Kyrgyzstan and western China, Tajik men carry CM48, a lineage often associated with Genghis Khan's descendants. Some carry Q haplogroups that trace back to the Xiongnu or even earlier eastern steppe populations. These are not relics, they are inherited memories, tucked inside the Y chromosome. Autosomal studies back this up. A portion of Tajik DNA clusters with ancient genomes from the eastern steppe, from Mongolia, from Siberia, from the realm of the Huns. And yet, when plotted alongside modern populations, Tajiks pull closer to Persians and Pashtun than to Kyrgyz or Uyghurs. Their East Asian strand is visible, but not defining. What's more telling is how little the language changed. Unlike many groups that adopted Turkic languages after genetic intermixing, the Tajiks held firm. They kept their Iranian tongue, modified, yes, but not replaced. They absorbed genes, but resisted linguistic replacement. It's a reflection of cultural resilience, or perhaps of deeper demographic stability. The Mongol conquest, often imagined as a wave that consumed Central Asia, left lighter footprints in the Tajik genome than expected. Perhaps it was the nature of the land, mountainous, difficult to control. Or perhaps it was the structure of Tajik society, village-based, decentralized, hard to penetrate at scale. Whatever the reason, their genetic map shows influence, without upheaval. And in that lies the heart of the mystery. For every Genghisid haplogroup that made its way into the Tajik gene pool, there were dozens of older lineages that stood their ground. Every East Asian fragment is surrounded by older scaffolding, markers that go back to the Bronze Age, to Bactria, to the Indo-Iranians. This was not a replacement. It was a layering, a quiet entanglement between East and West, one that enriched, but did not redefine. And so, the Tajiks carry a chapter of the East Asian epic, a footnote in the story of the steppes, not as the conquered or the erased, but as the inheritors of a region that was never one thing, a region where genetics, like history, was always being rewritten, but never entirely overwritten. In the eastern reaches of the Pamirs, where China's Xinjiang province climbs toward the sky, live a people whose very existence raises questions science didn't know it needed to ask. They are known as the Xinjiang Tajiks, and for centuries they have lived on the edge of the habitable world, in a place too cold for comfort, too high for breath, too remote for armies. And yet they adapted, but not in the way anyone anticipated. When researchers first studied high-altitude populations, they found patterns that echoed across continents. Tibetans develop unique versions of EPS1 and EGLN1, genes that regulate oxygen levels. Andean peoples showed different mutations, affecting the cardiovascular system. The assumption was that all high-altitude adaptations followed a narrow genetic path, shaped by convergent evolution. Then came the Xinjiang Tajiks. Living at over 3,000 meters above sea level, they had every reason to develop the same genomic tools. But the data didn't match the model. These Tajiks lacked the well-known altitude adaptive variants. Their EPS1 gene was ordinary. EGLN1 showed no special selection. Yet they thrived, generation after generation, in oxygen-starved environments that punish even the fittest outsiders. The answer lay elsewhere, in places no one thought to look. The adaptation of the Xinjiang Tajiks wasn't driven by the classic hypoxia-related genes. It was rooted in a different suite of traits, genes associated with skin pigmentation, cardiovascular structure, and UV radiation response. Variants in HERC2, BNC2, MPI, and BEST1 emerged as candidates, not for breath, but for survival in a setting where extreme sunlight, altitude-induced pressure, and chronic cold converge. This wasn't evolution following the rulebook. This was survival rewritten. And when scientists looked deeper into their genomes, another surprise emerged. These highland Tajiks carried an unusually diverse mixture of ancestries, combining significant West Eurasian, South Asian, and East Eurasian components. Some estimates showed over 40% South Asian-related ancestry in certain individuals. This was far higher than among lowland Tajiks in Dushanbe or Panjikent. Where did this come from? It pointed to a complex history of admixture-driven adaptation. Unlike other high-altitude groups that relied on isolated evolution, the Xinjiang Tajiks appear to have survived by absorbing genetic diversity from multiple directions, a process scientists call adaptive introgression. Their resilience wasn't built through mutation alone. It was shaped through the mixing of distant lineages, that brought new tools for enduring the elements. Their location made it possible. The Pamir Plateau has always been a confluence point, a place where the edges of civilizations brush against each other. Here, populations from South Asia, Inner Asia, and West Eurasia met, not in conquest, but in slow, human movement. And the result was not only cultural fusion, but biological innovation. What's striking is how different this makes them, even among other Tajiks. Genetic analyses show that Xinjiang Tajiks often plot apart from their linguistic kin, forming distinct clusters in principal component analyses. Their gene pool doesn't quite match the steppe BMAC mixture found in Tajiks of the West. It carries unique fingerprints of Siberian and Indus Valley-related ancestry, revealing a population forged in quiet isolation and relentless adaptation. The implications are enormous, because for decades, models of high-altitude biology were built around a single narrative: mutate or perish. But the Xinjiang Tajiks suggest something else, that diversity itself can be a survival strategy, that blending can substitute for mutation, that in harsh environments, complexity is its own kind of armor. They remind us that nature has more than one way of solving a problem. And sometimes the solution isn't in the strongest gene, but in the most unexpected combination. The story of the Xinjiang Tajiks isn't just about altitude. It's about resilience through mixture, a biological mosaic shaped not by conquest or collapse, but by generations of quiet endurance. Their blood remembers migrations others have forgotten. Their cells whisper of ancient neighbors now lost to time. And in their lungs, their skin, their hearts, evolution has carved a path no one thought to look for. In the great sweep of history, language often rides the tide of conquest. Armies arrive, empires rise, and tongues replace tongues, sometimes gradually, sometimes overnight. But what happens when the words change, and the people stay? This is the riddle at the heart of the Tajik story. Today, they speak a variety of Persian, soft, poetic, rhythmic, steeped in centuries of literature and mysticism. It links them to Rumi and Ferdowsi, to Shiraz and Isfahan. On the surface, it suggests an origin rooted deep within the Iranian plateau. But when scientists traced the ancestry of the Tajiks, they discovered something startling. The genes tell a different story. There's no evidence of mass migration from Western Iran into Central Asia that could account for the linguistic transformation. No demographic wave, no genetic footprint that matches the shift from Eastern Iranian dialects to a Western Iranian language. The DNA remains anchored to an older regional mixture: Andronovo steppe herders, BMAC agriculturalists, and local highland isolates. The genome is still Central Asian, but the language is not. So where did Persian come from? To answer that, we must turn to a different kind of force, not military, not biological, but cultural. In the centuries following the Arab conquest of Iran, the eastern frontiers of the Islamic world entered a phase of transformation. Cities like Balkh, Bokhara, and Samarkand became centers of Persianate culture, not imposed from without, but grown from within. Sogdian, once the dominant Iranian language of trade and diplomacy across the Silk Road, began to fade. Its dialects fractured, and in its place, Persian rose, the language of court, commerce, and scholarship. But the change didn't come from an influx of Persians. It came from the spread of prestige. Persian, revived and restructured after centuries of Arabic dominance, became the medium of poetry, theology, and science. It was the language of power, and in a cosmopolitan world where identity was increasingly tied to culture rather than clan, language became a choice, a marker of sophistication and access. And so, over time, the people who had once spoken Eastern Iranian dialects began speaking Western Persian. Their genomes remained stable, their villages unchanged, but their words transformed. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. This pattern, of language shifting without genetic replacement, has played out across Central Asia. The Uzbeks adopted Turkic while retaining largely Iranian ancestry. The Turkmen speak a Turkic tongue, but are genetically closer to their Iranian neighbors than to their linguistic cousins. And the Tajiks, in the opposite direction, embraced a Persian language without welcoming Persian blood. This reveals something fundamental. Language is not always tied to ancestry. Sometimes it spreads like a current, pulled forward by religion, by scholarship, by empire. Sometimes it becomes aspirational, like silk or script, a tool to enter a wider world. And yet, this shift wasn't uniform. Certain Tajik subgroups, like the Yagnobis, resisted the linguistic tide. To this day, they preserve an Eastern Iranian language, a linguistic fossil from a time before the Persian wave. And interestingly, their genetics differ slightly too. Less Southern input, more steppe continuity. Their story is a reminder that even in cultural transformation, some islands remain untouched. But for the majority of Tajiks, the Persianization of speech did not erase who they were. Instead, it layered a new identity atop an older one, a cultural adoption that enhanced rather than replaced. And so, we arrive at a paradox. A people genetically descended from Eastern Iranian ancestors, linguistically aligned with Western Iran, and culturally shaped by the fusion of both, with no invasion required. In the end, the Persian spoken by Tajiks did not arrive on the backs of settlers. It arrived through manuscripts, through court poets, through the slow gravity of civilization. It came not with the sword, but with the pen. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring kind of conquest. We often speak of the Tajiks as a single people, one language, one heritage, one region. But step into the mountain shadows of Badakhshan or walk the quiet alleys of Yanab Valley, and you'll find a different truth. Beneath the surface of a shared identity lies a mosaic of microhistories, each with its own genetic rhythm and ancestral story. Because the term Tajik isn't a biological blueprint. It's a cultural umbrella, one that shelters distinct populations who, though united by language and geography, carry different echoes of the past. Take the Pam Iris. Nestled deep in the eastern ranges, these highland communities speak languages that aren't dialects of Tajik, but entirely separate Eastern Iranian tongues, Waki, Shugni, Sarakoli, and more. Linguistically divergent, yes, but genetically, too. They bear unique signatures. Their DNA contains higher proportions of East Eurasian ancestry than their lowland counterparts. This isn't incidental. It reflects generations of contact with neighboring Turkic and Siberian populations, not through conquest, but through proximity and intermarriage in regions where cultural boundaries blur but topography isolates. And then there's the Yagnobi people, custodians of a language descended directly from Sogdian, the once powerful tongue of Central Asian merchants and priests. Isolated in their valley north of Dushanbe, they've resisted both linguistic assimilation and genetic admixture. Unlike other Tajik groups, they show little to no South Asian influence, and less East Asian input as well. Their genomes are remarkably close to Iron Age individuals excavated from the region, a living archive of Central Asia's ancient inhabitants. What sets the Yagnobis apart is not only what they carry, but what they lack. While other Tajik groups display genetic traces from medieval migrations, Turkic, South Asian, even minor Mongolic pulses, the Yagnobis seem genetically insulated, as if time folded around their valley and kept history at bay. They are less mixed, less rewritten. Their continuity is their distinction. But contrast that with the urban Tajiks of cities like Samarkand or Bokhara, regions historically exposed to trade, empire, and mobility. Here, the gene pool is broader. Haplogroups from the Near East, South Asia, and East Asia all make cameo appearances. The mixture reflects not a single migration, but 1,000 years of quiet mingling, layered through markets, marriages, and movements invisible to political maps. Even mitochondrial DNA, passed from mothers to children, tells a fragmented story. Some Tajik women carry lineages common in Europe and the Near East. Others hold haplogroups found in South Asia or northern China. One study identified over 90 distinct maternal lineages among just 150 Tajik samples. That's not noise. That's evidence of deep, maternal genetic complexity, a tapestry woven through thousands of births across thousands of years. And what about the Xinjiang Tajiks, far across the border in western China? Their genetic profile is the most unique of all. Compared to Tajiks in Tajikistan or Afghanistan, they carry elevated levels of South Asian ancestry, as well as traces from Siberian and Central Chinese sources. Their high-altitude lifestyle has also sculpted their biology in specific ways, setting them apart not only culturally, but physiologically. This isn't fragmentation. Its resilience. Because despite these differences in language, in admixture, in adaptation, the people who fall under the Tajik name still share a common historical foundation. Their genetic center remains rooted in the same Bronze and Iron Age fusion that defined early Indo-Iranian populations in the region. But that shared origin didn't erase regional nuance. Instead, it allowed for variation to bloom, shaped by rivers, passes, and political borders that rose and fell with time. One Tajik may carry the imprint of the Darim mummies. Another may descend from a Sogdian priest. A third may bear maternal DNA that hints at a long-forgotten traveler from India. Each a thread, each a story. And so, when we say Tajik, we are not naming a single genetic identity. We're describing a constellation, a set of points that orbit a shared center, but trace different arcs through time and space. A reminder that identity can be unified without being uniform. They share streets, markets, ancestral cities built under the same sun. Tajiks and Uzbeks, two names often whispered as opposites in the story of Central Asia. One speaks Persian, the other Turkic. One claims an Iranian heritage, the other a nomadic past. But peel back the skin of history, and something stranger emerges. The boundary between them is thinner than it seems. For decades, ethnic identity in this region has been written through the lens of language and empire. Uzbeks were labeled as heirs to Turkic Khaganates, Tajiks as descendants of ancient Iranians. But when researchers began comparing their genomes, the results challenged every textbook narrative. The DNA told a different tale. At a genetic level, Tajiks and Uzbeks are far more similar than their linguistic divisions suggest. In fact, some studies found less than 1% overall genetic distance between the two groups. That's less than what separates many regional dialect speakers within a single European country. So how did these different peoples become so alike? The key lies in a history that predates language. Both populations descend from the same ancient Central Asian foundation, a blend of Bronze Age steppe herders and Iranian plateau farmers. The same Indo-Iranian substrate runs through both groups. It's the scaffolding on which everything else was built. Then came the Turkic migrations. Starting around the 6th century CE, waves of Turkic-speaking nomads moved westward, settling in oases and intermingling with local populations. But this wasn't a demographic overhaul. It was a cultural shift. In many cases, Iranian-speaking communities gradually adopted Turkic languages, especially in regions dominated by steppe political power. That's how many ancestral Tajiks became Uzbeks. Their genes remained largely the same, but their tongue changed. Even today, you can trace the split. In Uzbek communities, Y-DNA haplogroup R1A, typical of Indo-Iranian lineages, remains widespread, though at slightly lower frequencies than in Tajiks. Other markers, like haplogroups J, L, and R2, also appear across both groups. These aren't coincidental overlaps. They point to shared ancestry, not parallel histories. What separates them most clearly is the East Asian component. Uzbeks tend to carry higher levels of East Eurasian admixture, often between 35% and 50%, depending on the region. This reflects the historical assimilation of Turkic nomads into the local gene pool. In contrast, Tajiks typically carry only 15% to 18% of East Asian ancestry, with some isolated groups showing even less. But even that difference has its limits. There are Uzbeks in the south, especially in the former Sogdian heartland, who show far less East Asian input and genetically overlap almost entirely with Tajik populations. Their families may speak Uzbek, but their chromosomes whisper in an older language. And that brings us to the paradox. The very terms Tajik and Uzbek are products of political history, not clear genetic divides. In many parts of Central Asia, identity was fluid. A shift in dynasty, a change in school instruction, or a new official language could redraw the lines of belonging, but rarely the lines of blood. Some families were labeled Tajik under one census, Uzbek in another. Entire villages shifted their declared identity depending on the ruling elite or the language of trade. These weren't lies, they were adaptations. Even physical traits, often stereotyped between the groups, failed to hold under scrutiny. There are light-eyed Uzbeks in Fergana, Tajiks with Mongoloid features and Badakhshan. The spectrum is continuous, not categorical. Which brings us to the illusion itself. The difference between Tajik and Uzbek, in many cases, is less about origin and more about evolution. Not who your ancestors were, but which path they walked when the fork came. Some took the road of Turkic language, aligning with new political powers. Others stayed in the linguistic stream of Persianate culture. Both paths emerged from the same soil, the same ancient genetic blend. So when we ask, what separates a Tajik from an Uzbek? The deeper question might be, how do we define difference at all? By tongue? By haplogroup? By imagined borders drawn by scholars and sultans? Or do we listen more carefully to the genome, to the ancient lineages they both carry, to the silent consensus of ancestry that outlives empire? Civilizations have come and gone across Central Asia like wind over stone, brief, forceful, and eventually erased. Cities rose on the banks of ancient rivers, fell to conquest, and vanished under layers of dust. Languages shifted, flags changed, religions took root, flourished, and fractured. But beneath it all, something deeper endured, not in books, not in monuments, but in the human body itself. The DNA of the Tajiks holds a secret that no war could burn, no empire could bury. A lineage that has survived the full arc of recorded history. This is not hyperbole. Ancient genomes extracted from Iron Age burials in what is now Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and northern Afghanistan reveal something extraordinary. The genetic profile of those 2,500-year-old individuals is strikingly similar to that of modern Tajiks. Not a vague resemblance, a direct echo. Few populations in the world can claim such long-standing continuity. Where others were reshaped by migration, invasion, and forced assimilation, the Tajik genome has maintained a remarkable degree of ancestral stability. It's as if the land itself preserved the genetic rhythm of its earliest settled peoples, the same blend of steppe pastoralists and southern farmers that first defined the region during the Bronze Age. But continuity does not mean stagnation. Across time, small additions arrived, from the east, from the south, from neighboring highlands. But these additions folded into the foundation rather than rewriting it. The genetic base remained intact, like an ancient melody over which new instruments occasionally played. One of the most powerful markers of this stability is found in the male lineage structure. Haplogroup R1az93, often associated with Indo-Iranian expansions, dominates the Y chromosome landscape of Tajik men. It didn't arrive recently. It has been rooted here for over 3 millennia. What's more, its subclades are narrow and repetitive, indicating strong founder effects. A handful of male ancestors, perhaps tribal leaders or early chieftains, left such a profound legacy that their genetic line continues across vast swaths of the modern Tajik population. This isn't just an artifact of population size. It suggests social continuity, the preservation of lineages over dozens of generations, uninterrupted by foreign replacement or widespread displacement. In a region famous for conquest, the Tajiks somehow remained, not untouched, but unbroken. Even when empires like the Achaemenids, the Kushans, or the Timurids ruled over these lands, their demographic impact was relatively shallow. Cultural change came, but the genetic core endured. Each layer of history added nuance, but the structure beneath stayed remarkably consistent. Compare this with other regions of Eurasia, where migrations often erased the previous genetic landscape. The British Isles, for example, saw significant turnover between the Neolithic, Bronze, and Iron Ages. In Anatolia, layers of conquest from Indo-Europeans, Persians, Greeks, and Turks deeply reshaped the gene pool. But in Central Asia, particularly among Tajiks, the ancestral thread holds firm. It's even visible in mitochondrial DNA, which tracks maternal lines. Tajik women today carry many of the same haplogroups found in ancient samples, evidence that this continuity wasn't limited to warrior lineages or elite males. It ran through entire communities, mothers, daughters, and sons, living, marrying, and surviving in the same valleys for thousands of years. And yet, this story was hidden for centuries, because the world paid more attention to the conquerors, to the Mongols who thundered through, to the Turks who reshaped tongues, to the Russians who redrew maps. The Tajiks were often overlooked, dismissed as remnants of an older time. But in that dismissal lies the truth. They are remnants, and they are still here. Remnants not of defeat, but of endurance. They did not need to conquer continents to write their legacy. Their legacy is in their persistence, in the unbroken thread, from the Bronze Age to the present, in the genetic bridge that links ancient herders and farmers to modern students and shopkeepers in Dushanbe, Kujand, and Korak. And so, Central Asia's heart beats with a continuity rare in the human story. While others were uprooted, the Tajiks held fast. Their genes tell of a population that absorbed the winds of change, but remained anchored in place. Not frozen in time, but forged by it. In the silent corridors of deep time, where history leaves no inscription and memory has no language, only one witness remains: DNA. Unseen, undisturbed, undeniable. It does not exaggerate. It does not forget. While kings are lost to erasure and cities crumble into dust, the double helix carries forward stories too old for parchment, too intimate for chronicles. And in the case of the Tajiks, that story reads like a palimpsest, not of conquest or replacement, but of layered resilience. It is a record written not in empire, but in inheritance. Because long before the world knew names like Sogdian, Persian, or Mongol, these lands were inhabited by people whose legacy persists, not in tombstones, but in mitochondria. Their existence is carved into the code of the living, and nowhere is that legacy more intricately preserved than in the Tajik genome. What makes it remarkable is not just who they descend from, but what has survived inside them. Fragments of lineages that vanished from maps still whisper in their blood. Genetic variants tied to lost populations, Darim basin isolates, BMAC urbanites, and de novo riders, and Indus-related farmers, all continue in silence, encoded in the physiology of a modern people who never declared themselves heirs to any of it. Some lineages are so old, they predate the written word itself. Others trace through maternal lines, unbroken for millennia, from the shadowed past to the present, passed not through war or doctrine, but from one daughter to the next, unnoticed. It is here that we encounter something few expect from history: invisible continuity. When geneticists look at the Tajik genome, they see layers of ancient components that have largely disappeared elsewhere. The East Iranian backbone, long overwritten in neighboring populations, still stands. The Bactrian thread, elusive in archaeology, is preserved here. Even hints of the earliest Central Asian isolates, those predating Indo-European dispersals, remain embedded like genetic fossils within modern DNA. This isn't the product of isolation alone. It's the result of generations who adapted, integrated, and endured without erasing the roots beneath them. Where many regions were genetically reconfigured by mass migration, the Tajik genome evolved with continuity rather than collapse. And that makes it a time capsule, a molecular archive, one that holds not only the answers to local ancestry, but to broader questions about how humanity moved, merged, and made sense of identity before borders and flags. It's also a mirror, reflecting contradictions no map can resolve. A Western Iranian language on an Eastern Iranian genome. A Persianate identity forged by people with South Asian and East Eurasian components. A nation that shares more with ancient highland farmers than with the empires that once ruled over them. These are not anomalies. They are the norm of real history, complex, inconsistent, alive. The DNA that time forgot isn't forgotten at all. It pulses in veins. It shapes faces. It breathes in lungs adapted to thin air and sun-scorched valleys. It survives in people who have never read the studies that carry their story, yet live it every day. And perhaps that is the final twist in the Tajik story. While scholars debated who they are, Iranian, Central Asian, Indo-European, their DNA never paused. It never cared for category. It simply remembered, not as a monument, but as a function, not in words, but in code. And now, with every genome sequenced, that ancient silence speaks, revealing a people not defined by what changed, but by what never disappeared.